Hello, this is Falling from Team Liquid, and this is about how Smartcasting affects spells, specifically spells that do strictly damage. But before I do talk about Smartcasting in general, I'm going to choose a non-controversial example to what I'm talking about before I move on. And my example is the Ghost with Nuke. In Brood War, it was very hard to get. It's a high-tech and cost and supply, but in compensation for that, there's a huge damage. No actual unit survives the impact except for battle cruisers, and just with an inch of its life, and it does a pretty good number on even Black's barracks, and it'll. And a command center, it'll take out two nukes will take out a command center. And in comparison, StarCraft 2, there's no skill difference. There's no required difficulty that makes it any harder to use from one to the other. But simply by making the unit more available, or the ability more available, they had to nerf the actual damage of it, or it just would have been too much. It would have been imbalanced, and it would have been a game of just racing to nukes and just blowing everything up with nukes. But just so for comparison, these actually have a fair number of units that survive the nuke impact, the direct hit, and some by quite a bit. I didn't do the mothership, but that doesn't even do hull damage, and it takes about 3 to take out a command center. And so that's just simply, if the area of effect damage is more easily available, it has to do less damage overall. And so I'm going to go back to Brood War. And so why this makes a difference with Smartcasting is the entire idea is to make the spells more easily played. And so what we've seen is a whole bunch of nerfs to damage. You could talk about EMP and a bunch of other ones, but I'm going to focus just on the High Templar for this video. So for example, if the Mutalisk stayed underneath the storm the entire time, it gets stormed to an inch of its life like that, down to 10. Similarly, something like the Lurker also gets, I'm trying to move those guys down, within an inch of its life, down to 15, 14, and it heals itself. And something like the Hydralisk, if they stay under it, will get wiped out completely. And Zerglings and Hydralisks are sort of your main massable unit for the Zerg army. And similarly, if we stormed Dragoons, the first hit will take them out by more than half, and the second will just completely finish them off. And in comparison, with StarCraft 2, I'm going to have to... It's just a lot less damage overall, which isn't to say it isn't balanced. It's actually, the damage that it does is balanced. But it doesn't look like it gives as big of an impact on the game. There's just, when people are saying, oh, we want our spells to be smarter, we're not actually talking about the same spells anymore. So if I stayed underneath this the entire time, it goes down to about 80, possibly 70 if I had it all the way down. So that's 80 out of 120. 70 out of 120. Roach, if it stays under the storm the entire time, and it goes down to about just under half of its health, compared to getting completely wiped out like the Brood War Hydralisk. And then you have the Hydralisk that, if it stays under completely, goes down to 1. So that always takes 2 storms to kill it. And so there's sort of this idea, well, we want to make spellcasters easier to use. But that does mean that the damage we have to compensate for that. Damage becomes less. The other thing is, the entire idea of making spellcasters easier to use is interesting because spellcasters are, by their very existence, designed to be more difficult. You don't actually have to have an RTS game that has spellcasters at all. You can have the entire game just made up of units that move in and then attack. And that's a good portion of RTS games have that. So, and it's just a more difficult unit by design. Okay, so then, well, maybe it was hard, and it's designed to be hard, but it was too hard. So StarCraft 2 is going to try and fix that with Smartcasting. But there's a few implications or cause effects that Smartcasting has that I'd like to point out, and 4 in particular. In fact, so the first thing is that we say that Smartcasting makes it easier to do. Because it's just hit T and then click, 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 click. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Because before it had this big impact where you just get off a couple spells, and then that's pretty good. The how it impacts the game is pretty decent. And we can be happy with a couple storms, and it swings the battle quite a bit in our favor. But when we've added Smartcasting, then the individual spell no longer has that huge impact to swing the battle. We must get out a whole bunch of storms all at once, and so it may be that it's easier. But what we've also done is we've actually raised the bar of how many storms must be in a game to get the full impact, because we've basically diluted the spell. Normally, you're just a couple storms and you're feeling awesome. It has that huge sort of visceral impact. So there's stuff dying and you're feeling awesome, even if you're a newbie player. And we've taken that and we said you must spam a whole ton of spells for you to get the same sort of damage or swing the battle in your favor. And the sort of player that would have difficulty sending off one spell and then the other, I think it's the same sort of player that's going to have troubles with grabbing a whole bunch of casters and then having to saturate the entire screen, because that's what you basically have to do with StarCraft 2, is just cover the army with casting. And that's, although it may be easier than the Brood War equivalent, it's still a difficult thing to do. And that's the sort of player, I think, if that's the player we're worried about, is the sort of player that's just going to grab Colossi and attack and do something that doesn't require spellcasters. So I don't know that we've actually made things as easier, like we said. And I think we've lost a bit of the incentive to try and get faster at spells. The powerful spell is actually one of the reasons why I switched from Terran to Protoss in Brood War. I was super newbie, so I'd sit behind all these cannon walls, and then the computer would attack me, and then I'd get off a storm, and I'd just feel awesome because, you know, you just see a whole bunch of things die, and even if you only got 1 or 2 storms off, it's just like, yeah, it has that much obvious damage, not sort of like if you do on an Ultralist is kind of what happens with your a rote. Yeah, it's bad, it does damage, but it doesn't feel the same way. It doesn't have that huge feeling of power and damage that it does when when it's not balanced around the idea of diluting the spell to be just saturate the entire screen. And so that's number 1. Number 2 is the change in the spells from Smartcasting, or from what we had before to Smartcasting, actually changes sort of the decision making on storms. And what we've done, intentionally, is tried to make it easier. The unintentional effect is we've turned the spell from a high impact, high concentration spell, we're only going to get a couple off, to a spell that we evenly distribute throughout the entire screen. So screen saturation of a storm. And what that difference makes is if it's hard to do spells, then when you are going to do spells, it's of the utmost of importance that you pick your spots that are really important. And so that basically creates targets. So I see that there's more grouping up here. I am going to only be able to, I'm kind of slow. In a battle, I'm only going to get 2 storms off, so I'm going to prioritize which groups that I'm going to do. And this is sort of compounded in Brood War because you have uneven unit movement compared to the much more uniform movement. And the non-uniformity of movement actually creates targets. So there's more, I would suggest, more decision making. Am I going to storm here? Well, there's less damage there. But there's a juicier target there, but I'm going to storm. And there's a juicy target here. Compared to, going back to StarCraft 2, when we just have a whole group of Stormcasters and it's really easy to storm by comparison, our decision making is basically lay down as many storms as we can, saturate the screen, and so we've actually lose a bit of decision making just because the individual storm is not so important. What's important is just spam click to cover the entire army. And with uniform troop movement, there's less available targets. You just sort of get the army as a whole. So it's the difference between there's actual targets, decision making for you to go for, or just sort of cover the entire screen. So the third thing has to do with harass, and this is kind of sort of an ironic thing, I think, because Blizzard's been trying to focus on units that work outside the death ball, units that won't destroy workers for some reason, but they're sitting on a gold mine, and we used to, in the form of High Templar, and we used to get a lot more storm drops, and we don't seem to anymore. And part of the reason why is with Smartcasting, the spell is balanced around the idea of covering the entire screen. That's the expectation, because it's easier to do. It's so we've moved from high concentration shot to cover the entire screen. The problem with that is with when you want to harass, you want high concentration in certain areas. And oh, I forgot to rebuild that. And so what it becomes is a bit of a dynamic between the different players. Is you can drop off the storm or the Templar to storm, and then the player sees that there is Templars coming, so they're going to pull their workers away so they can't be dropped. But in turn, the Protoss player can see that, drop there wherever they're running, and then storm there. And so it's this sort of back and forth interplay between units. And this actually operates outside the death ball. You can move it into harass and drop it. You can move it back to defense and defend there. And then you can move it back into the main army and attack there. It's a very versatile sort of unit, and yet because it's balanced around the idea of even distribution of damage across the screen, then it's not as cost effective or not as worth it to send it into harass. Yeah, you'll see some people use it for harass, but the cost of it compared to the rapid damage that you need to make it worth it is a lot less. There might be some other issues with being able to snipe shuttles and things like that. I'm not entirely sure, but that's, I would say, a issue. And the fourth thing